Well, it sounds like y'all are ready. I'm telling you, it's still a minute until time, and y'all have gotten quiet. I may need the extra minute this morning, or I may run out before I get there. I don't know. It's always a surprise to me whether I make it or don't, you know. Depends on how long-winded I get. And I am a lipe, so if y'all have ever known my dad or my brother or sister, we can tend to be a little long-winded. We like to talk. I had an uncle who was a speaker, and he said he didn't mind talking to himself because he liked listening to a good speaker and he liked speaking to an attentive audience. So I think that kind of falls in the pocket. We're continuing our study in Romans this morning. You know, the Bible's not written with chapters and verses. You know, it all is written together. I've got a couple of translations that I read sometime that are not broken down. Obviously, they're broken down into books, but they're not broken down into chapters and verses. And it makes it interesting reading, you know, if you're just reading along because you don't have those breaks. Kind of tough to use it as a study Bible because if you're looking for something, you know, you kind of guess where it is if they don't have chapters and verses. But having said that, Romans 9, 10, and 11 are really one big block of information. And we're going to study 9, 10, and 11 together, hopefully this morning, because I anticipate my attempt is to finish this study on Romans by the end of the month, which leaves us today and maybe 3 or 4 more Sundays. So we're going to have to skip on through pretty good. Anyway, so we'll begin here in chapter 9. We studied, I think, last week through about verse 15. It begins by Paul showing his desire for the Jews, for the Israelites, for his people. And it starts in verse 1 saying, I'm telling the truth in Christ, I'm not lying. By my conscience bearing the holy witness in the Holy Spirit, I have great sorrow and unceasing grief in my heart. And he says that because he's pining, he's suffering mentally and spiritually because of the Israelites. Now, we know when we started this lesson, the book of Hebrews, written to who? Duh, the Hebrews, to Jews, okay? Well, the Romans is written to Romans, Gentiles. However, we do know from the writings, especially chapters 9, 10, and 11, that there are Jews in the churches in Rome. Now, there are about 2 million people in Rome, and they didn't have a big old building where all of the Christians met in Rome. They were still doing churches in people's homes and wherever they had meeting places. So this letter is not written necessarily to one congregation per se. It's written to the churches in Rome. Among some of the members were Jews. And you know, the Jews at this point, maybe even still have in their hearts a strong prejudice toward Gentiles. They just felt like they were the chosen ones of God. This promise has been made to Abraham. We're all children of Abraham, and the Gentiles don't have any part of this. Well, Paul, through this section, is reminding them, as we talked about last week, that just because you're a child of Abraham doesn't mean you're an Israelite. Because Abraham had Ishmael, Arabs from Keturah. Later, after Sarah had died, he had 5 more sons. Well, they're not Israelites, even though the promise was given to Abraham. Then the promise comes to Isaac, all right? So what about all the children of Isaac? Are they all Israelites? No, we got Esau. Esau descendants were the Edomites. We talked about that last week. But so the son through whom the promise was given to Abraham, it was given to Isaac, and it was restated to Jacob. Okay? So we know Saul's name was changed to Paul. We know Abram's name was changed to Abraham. Didn't Jacob as well have a name change? His name was changed to Israel. Okay, Israelites. All right, they got to come from Jacob. That's where the promise came through. So you follow this line. So the Israelites, when they look back to Abraham, Isaac, but Jacob is where the promise came, his name being changed to the Israelites. And as we end up here at verse 15, 13. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. We talked last week about hated really means just loved. He didn't hate Esau, he just loved Jacob more. So we finally get to Jacob here when he's talking to these Jews, these Israelites. We follow it down, so Jacob is where the promise comes. 14, what shall we say then? Is there is no injustice with God, is there? See, the Jews are saying, wait a minute, we've got this promise, and it's been promised to us, and what are you talking about? Gentiles. I mean, that's not right. He's promised us. If you're right, then God's changed. He's changed his plan. Well, Paul's response will be, may it never be. So the Jews are having a problem studying and accepting the gospel. What were they still attached to? The law of, even though it was God's law, it's always referred to as the God of Moses, the law of Moses, okay? So, Paul says, for he says to Moses, all right? You going to argue this thing and tell me that God has changed and stuff is different? He says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then, does it not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy? So then depend on the man who has wills, what the man wants, or the man who runs. Runs doesn't mean run away or run toward. Runs is kind of a works oriented. If he's running, if he's in the race, it still goes back to works. Okay, the man who's working, the man who's running. So, no, it does not depend, verse 16, does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. Man doesn't have anything to say about this. Mr. Woody Loden, most of you remember, said God saves you on his plan. It's God's plan by which you're saved, not something that any of us or anyone outside this building is going to come up to. Thankfully, God has mercy on the merciful. Now, here's something we need to stop and think about just a little bit. What did Jesus say? Blessed be who? Blessed be the merciful. He will receive mercy, okay? He has steadfast love and shows mercy upon those who love him and keep his commandments. That goes back to Moses. That's Exodus 20. So Paul is saying this, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. He's going back to Moses, so they can't deny that. That's coming from the law, right? I mean, this is Moses. This is the main guy for the Jews. One who confesses and forsakes his sins will receive God's mercy. That's in Proverbs. Proverbs 28. If you show mercy, you will receive mercy. What does James say about that? He turns that thing around and says, there is no mercy to one who shows no mercy. That's the one we need to stop and think about, brothers and sisters. I raised my hand first, but we need to think about how merciful we are. Because if we want mercy from God, got to be merciful. I didn't say that. Well, I did, but I didn't come up with it, okay? Merciful. If you want mercy, you have to be merciful. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I'm back in 9:17, for this very purpose I raised you up to demonstrate my power in you, and that your name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. Well, we talk about this predestination thing, and there are other times in this section here we'll talk about the hardening of the heart. Does God tempt us? Does God turn us away from him? No, he reaches out to us in the prayer, lead us not into temptation. God's not leading us into temptation. Don't allow Satan to lead us into temptation is basically what we're talking about here. As for Pharaoh, he was already alive, he was already born, he was already a grown man. He had already decided in his heart what he was going to do. God knew this and said, I raised you up and put you in power just for this, just so my power would be known. Just like he did the Assyrians with the northern kingdom. The Assyrians were a Gentile nation. Horrible warriors, horrible people. God referred to them as his rod, his chastening rod. God used them for his purpose. God put him on the throne, not because of predestination, but raised him up to power. Even against his rebellion, what did God do? Used him for his purpose, even though he was rebellious against God. The all-powerful, majestic, sovereign God that we serve used him for the power, no matter how Pharaoh felt about it. And he says that he hardened his heart so that his power might be proclaimed, his might, his power might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. Anybody remember what was happening in Joshua chapter 2? Maybe not right off the bat, but anybody ever heard of a town called Jericho? There, pardon? Rahab of Jericho says, look, we know about y'all's God. We heard all about that. The Red Sea, all of this stuff was his power proclaimed. Even that very event. And what we know about Rahab's descendants. David's great-great-grandmother, maybe. I might be wrong about that, but close. Maybe one great off. But anyway, through Rahab comes the promise. So we see not predestination, we see the power of God, and we see that power is mercy. That's worth just stopping for a minute, isn't it? We think of power being aggression and power being the one that's going to overrun, but what is power really? Power is the ability to show mercy. What does Romans 1:16 say that the gospel is? What is the gospel? What does it say, Brother Jimmy? The gospel is the power of God to bring men to salvation. The power of God. He does what he wants to. He has mercy on who he wants, and he does not show mercy on who he does not. Verse 18, he does what he wants to. God created all things. It's his choice. Then in 19, he says, what will you say to me? Why does he still find this fault? Who resists his will? On the contrary, New King James says, oh, foolish man, I think. One does not answer. Who answers back to God? Will the thing that has been made ask the maker, why did you make me this way? Why did you? What does the product have to do? How can we question God? What gives us the right or the power or the knowledge to question what God does? God's got a plan in motion. It's been in motion since the beginning of time, and it is not going to change. He goes into this section now about the honorable versus the common thing. The potter's going to make one pot for something very honorable and the other one for common. In my mind, I pictured that maybe the term, not getting too base here, but some of us older people remember a slop jar. Okay, some things are made for an honorable thing, some things are made for maybe a more common thing, and that's kind of the analogy that Paul's using here. He goes into this whole section of God's patience. What if God, though willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience the vessels of wrath? How much patience did he have? How much patience did he have with Pharaoh? How many plagues were there? 10. Do we think that those happened just 10 days in a row? I don't know. Maybe it says this day and then the next day and the next day. I don't remember it that way. He was patient to objects of mercy. And who does that include? Objects of mercy. Me, I'll raise my hand. Y'all, objects of mercy. The Jews claimed if Paul was right, then God's changed his plan. All right? I mean, he promised us and that we were going to be, we're his chosen people. Well, boom, he goes right into Isaiah and to Hosea, quoting that says, I will call those who are not my people, and her who is not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are my people, there shall be called sons of the living God, to those that are called not my people. And then he talks about the fact that there is going to be a remnant of these Israelites left. We'll talk some more about that momentarily. But it's God's plan. God's put his plan into motion, and he will save those who are called, and we'll get there momentarily. So, verse 30, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. Oh my goodness, here's the book of Romans. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law, because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it was by works. It doesn't matter how many sacrifices. What does Micah say? 5 and 6 or 6 and 5? I always get that confused. Did God want 1,000 rams slaughtered and rivers of oil? And this is Old Testament. He didn't want all of those things. He wanted the heart. He wanted someone with faith. These acts are not what are going to save the Jews, and they're not going to and it's not what's going to save us. Showing up, singing, praying, the book. We're not going to work ourselves into heaven, y'all. It's the grace of God through our faith and through his mercy. That's what's going to get us into heaven. It is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. He who believes in him will not be disappointed. Peter, Matthew, Romans all refer to that stumbling block. It can't be a stumbling block. Not that we won't bump our toe on it and trip sometime, but we will see in chapter 10 that the mercy of God is what will save all people, Jews and Gentiles. Paul continues through verses 1 through 4 to show his love and desire to salvation of the Jews. Because my heart's desire and my prayer is for them, that their salvation. For I bear them witness that they have a, he keeps talking about them and they and their. He's referring to the Jews, those unbelieving Jews, those Jews who have fallen away. I noticed that Paul didn't say us. And what is Paul? A Jew of Jews. He will say here, look, I'm a descendant of Abraham. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. I'm all of this. But he's not including him in this group because they are those who are still searching for righteousness on their own. They have zeal. Verse 2, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. For not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own. Seeking to establish their own. What do we call that today when we talk about people? Self-righteous. They didn't get it from somewhere else. It's self-righteousness. What's Paul saying right there? That's not going to get it. You're not going to self-righteous yourself. They were seeking to establish their own. It's not God's plan. So what does he tell them? Verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So Christ is the end of that old law. It says it. And it's also the stopping point. Christ is the end. That's as far as we need to go for that righteousness. Once again, where does he go? Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness. That's what you're going to have. But the righteousness based on faith, i.e., not on the law, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Who will descend to the abyss? That is to bring him up from the grave. But what does he say? The word is near you. By this verse 5, Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness. What does that sound like? Faith? No, if he's practicing, it sounds like works. Okay? The works aren't going to get us there. Working that law, obeying the law is not going to get it. The word is near you and in your mouth. Where is faith? It's in our heart. It's not in our hands. Now James will say, I'll show you by faith by what I do with my hands. That's another story altogether. Okay. But the faith that Paul is referring to here is salvation. Who believes in him will not be put to shame. We have faith that is a focus on Christ. There's no distinction between the Jew and the Gentile. He is the Lord of all. Maybe that says verse, my red ink was playing out. Verse 9. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believes, that's once, in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart man believes, that's twice, resulting, that's once, in salvation, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting, that's twice, in salvation. In that one little section, belief, 2 times, results in righteousness and salvation. It says that twice, 2 times. You think he means that? If he's going to that point to tell us 2 times? If you didn't catch me the first time, let me say it again. So, belief results in salvation and righteousness. Well, how are you going to do that? For how shall then they call upon him in whom they've not believed? If you got to believe it, how are you going to believe it? Well, first thing you got to do, you got to hear about it. We know this section from the plan of salvation. At first you got to hear, then you got to believe. That's where all of these things come from. And what's Paul doing right now? He's telling them. He's bringing them. You've heard it. You've believed it. Faith cometh by hearing. Have they heard it? Yes. All the world, it says. That all of the world is gone out. Verse 18, the voice has gone out into all the world, their words to the ends of the world. But I say, surely did not know, did they? At first Moses said, I will make you jealous by that which is not a nation. By a nation without understanding I will anger you. And Isaiah is very bold and says, it was found by those who sought me not, and I became manifest to those who did not ask for me. So Paul's laying it out to them. Jews, it's not about the law. It's not about your self-righteousness. It's not about performing all of these things that are in Leviticus. Good gracious, people, if we were still under that, we'd have to get here on Wednesday and go all the way through next Tuesday to do all of those things. There were so many things in the law that they had to have a complete set of people, the Levites, and all of their families just to do all of the works necessary under the law. If you don't think it's complex, go back and read Leviticus if you can get through it. It'll take you a while. Interesting reading, granted, but man, oh man, the law was something else. Okay, God continued to reach out to them through his prophets, then through John the Baptist, then through Jesus and his apostles and their disciples. Had they heard? They had heard. They had heard. The question was asked, maybe by Jesus, I think. Somebody help me out. Which one of the prophets didn't y'all kill? Didn't y'all kill all of them? They had heard, but they did not listen. I think I went ahead and marked Jeremiah 15:1. Now, I don't know whether I've gotten there yet. Maybe we hadn't talked about Elijah. No, that's maybe 11. If not, we will. Jeremiah 15, chapter 15, verse 1. Then the Lord said to me, even though Moses and Samuel were to stand before me, my heart would not be with this people. Send them away from my presence and let them go. If Moses and Samuel that's pretty strong, isn't it? I think God had made up his mind. I can't think of two people that could have changed his mind any better than either one of those two guys. He said, even if they ask, not going to happen. I'm sending them away. A new nation, a new covenant. Jews, it's not y'all anymore. It's Jew and Gentile. Okay, I'm rushing and I'm on schedule, but I got about 2 minutes here. If y'all got questions or comments before we go into chapter 11. Not 2 minutes before we through. I got 3 chapters and I figured 15 minutes per, so I'm looking at the clock. Got to stay on time. Okay, this making sense? I don't see how it could not. Paul's laying it out as plain as he can to these Jews that it's not about your heritage, it's not about the law, it's not about all of that. Chapter 11, I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be. Paul says, hey, what about me? For I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hadn't rejected his people who he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says about the passage about Elijah? How he pleads with God against Israel. All right, this is where I was afraid I had skipped over. Paul says he hadn't forgot about the Jews, hadn't forgot about the Israelites. Look at me, here I am. I'm preaching to y'all. I'm Jew as it gets, Jewish as it gets. I'm a Hebrew, son of Benjamin, followed through the Jacob line. I mean, I'm from one of the 12 tribes. That's exactly right. Melvin brings up that he's tried through all of these other ways to this obstinate people, even if Moses and Samuel said, I'm not going to turn. But now I'm offering you this salvation through Christ, through your faith in him, through my mercy. So he foreknew. It's not predestination. God knew what was going to happen. You remember the Elijah story. It happened right after the Carmel, was it Mount Carmel, where they had the contest and all the prophets of Baal came in and he called down the fire on the wet altar and all of this, and they killed a bunch of the prophets of Baal. I think Elijah killed them that day. Maybe he himself did it, and Jezebel went through the roof. So Elijah runs and he's hiding. And he prays and says, God, do something. They've killed my prophets. They've torn down thine altars. I'm left alone. They're seeking my life. God says, oh, no. What? It was a thunder, and then there was a storm and a cloud and all of these big things. And then there was just a quiet little wind. And in that wind is when God spoke to him and said, look, you're not by yourself. Number one, you got me. Number two, I still got, 7,000 men who have not bowed their knee to Baal. Now, I'm assuming that he meant in Israel. Now, you remember divided kingdom. Notice that when Paul quotes from back to the Old Testament, he uses Isaiah, 750-ish BC. He uses Hosea. They were not twin brothers. 750 BC. This is before the divided kingdom. So when he speaks to Israel, he's also talking about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, even though he doesn't bring up Judah, because there may be some of these people that Paul is talking to that were in the 10, that are descendants from the 10 tribes that were in the north. So he's not making that distinction. As a matter of fact, he's using Elijah here. Speaks of Israel. It includes Ahab, Jezebel, evil Manasseh that probably sawed Isaiah in half, they claim, with a wooden saw. He's including those people in this group. There was a remnant. But where did that remnant come from? By their works? Even back then, it came through the grace of God. Okay, what then? That which Israel, I'm in verse 7 now. What then? That which Israel is seeking for, it has not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David, see, we still can't dispute anything he's saying. He's using Moses, he's using Isaiah, Hosea, David. Let their table become a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and to bend their backs forever. It was not obtained by their birth heritage. Doesn't matter that they were born into Judaism. It was by God's choice. You get to thinking about it. What's the best way really to learn a lesson? Maybe the experience God had to show them. If you don't believe me, if you don't believe that fire will burn your hand, what's the best way to figure that out? Then you'll know, won't you? So Paul's kind of telling them, guys, don't you see? Have you not learned by all of these things that I'm telling you? As we get older, all of us, I guess, tend to repeat ourselves, but I'm always intrigued by maybe because I can relate, by a line by William Shakespeare. And he said, "He who jests at scars hath never felt the wound." If you laugh at a scar, you've never felt what caused that scar. Okay? So sometimes the only way to learn a lesson is to feel the wound. Not that it gets funny after that. Okay? So, verse 11. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? Did they fall? Their unbelief opened the door to the rest of the world. So that's not a complete failure, is it? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. So Paul's telling them, look, this animosity that you've got towards the Jews, it should make you want what they've got. It was taken away from you and given to them. Don't you want it back? Don't you want to share it? Share it with them? Hopefully their jealousy of the Gentiles is what would bring them back to God. Then what would that fall be? It would be a stumble. It wouldn't be a fall. It would bring them back to God, which is what Paul is trying to show them right here. If their wrong resulted in salvation, now if the transgression, verse 12, now if their transgression be riches for the world and their failure be riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? If by y'all's mistake more people were saved and you come back, how do you think God's going to bless you now? If God sacrificed, if he loved us so much to sacrifice his son, to pay that ultimate price, why would we think that the blessings that come from that are not going to be more than we can imagine? That's the same thing he's telling them. We stumble, we fall, but we come back. How much greater is it going to be from the return? Peter says it's like the sow going back and the dog going back. It's worse for those that never even heard about it than it is for those who knew, came back and left, or who never came back from the understanding. So we see that it's the same analogy as God sacrificing his son, because he talks about life and death. Those are somewhere in there. How much greater would there? I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles, inasmuch as then I am as apostle to the Gentiles. I magnify my ministry, that somehow I might be more that move jealousy to my fellow countrymen and save some of them. For their rejection be the reconciliation of the world. What will their acceptance be but life from the dead? See, we have this analogy of baptism, the resurrection of Christ being from the dead back to life. The Jews are now coming from the dead of their righteousness by the law into life through righteousness by faith. Pretty straight ahead, Paul. Ooh, he's laying it out. I don't know how they could not understand. All right, so he ends that section there by saying, and if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also. You know, we studied about that some on Wednesday night through Corinthians with the leavening affecting the whole batch. And if the root be holy, the branches are too. What do we think of when he brings up this root analogy? What was David called? And what was Christ called? The root of Jesse. Okay, so we see this root analogy that we in these later days can see whether or not they caught on to it or not, but he talks about the root and these branches, that if they are an unfruitful branch, what did Jesus say need to happen to it? It ain't bearing any fruit. Why you need to leave it on the tree? Cut it off. Throw it in the fire. That they understand. The olive tree, that was how they made a living, got their oil, got all kind of stuff from the olive tree. If it's not doing any good, cut it off. And it's like the Gentiles are being grafted in. My daddy used to like to graft trees. Somebody in here grafts. Can't do. Maybe Bobby Jeffcoat. I don't know. Anyway, grafting in a limb. Cut that dude and tape it up. Daddy, I used to watch him do it all the time. And it'd grow. You just put a limb on to a tree and it would grow. So Paul is saying the Gentiles will be grafted in. But hey, Gentiles, what if you don't produce fruit? You can get cut off too. And what about these Jews? What if we take that other old branch from another tree and graft it in? So, basically he's telling them that the Jews can be grafted back in just like you're being grafted in. So, 1 Corinthians again, don't be arrogant. Gentiles aren't in any position to be arrogant against the Jews as the Jews are against the Gentiles. Unity, unity. Original broken branches could be stronger than the wild branches. Whether pottery or olive tree analogy, Paul continues to use faith versus unbelief. Through unbelief, the natural branches were broken off. Through faith, the wild branches were grafted in. Through faith, the natural branches are brought back in. All right, verses 25 through 27 talk about this partial hardness. We see that it's temporary. I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, lest you get wise in your own estimation. Where is the wisdom of man? That's been asked before, hasn't it? That a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. So we see that it's a partial hardness. There's going to be that remnant. Deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from, and he calls him Jacob. He doesn't say Israel, but he's saying it comes from Jacob. That's where it came from. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of their fathers, for the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. How many times did the prophets, or did God say to the prophets, no, I really ought to hammer this guy, but I'm not going to do it. Why? Because of my servant David, or because of my servant, he went back to the fathers, the promises that he had made, for the love he had. I'm going to endure this wrath because of the promises for the sake of the fathers. And also to the promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, their fathers. So the promise was made, and he's not going to change. And verse 29 says that the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. They hadn't changed. That's what the Jews were saying. Oh, God's changed his. We were it, and now they're bringing in these Gentiles. What? The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. God's mercy is shown to all Jews and Gentiles, not through disobedience, but through the mercy of God. For just as you, verse 30, just as you were once disobedient to God, but now you have been shown mercy because of their disobedience. So these now have been disobedient in order that because of the mercy of God, that you may be shown mercy. For God has shut up all disobedience that he might show mercy to all. Jews and Gentiles. Not through their disobedience, but through the mercy of God. Okay, one of the fundamental principles of the gospel, I'll leave this last thing I wrote here. One of the fundamental principles of the gospel is that man is brought as an individual to God by his grace. You know, the apostles asked Jesus one time, they saw that guy and said, is he crippled because of his sins or because of the sins of his parents? It's not that. No specific race or nationality has privileged status. The new Israel is made up of all races and tongues. It is not implying certainly that all Israelites will be saved. It does probably mean that a substantial number of Israelites would heed the gospel call before the end of the present age. Those Jewish converts will be saved exactly the same way and by the same means as everyone else being saved today. And that's through the grace and the mercy of God. End of Paul's point to the Jews. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll begin with chapter 12 of chapter 12, verse 1 of Romans next week.